The battles of 1916 had already proven one brutal truth. On the Western Front, even victory was a kind of defeat. For a few hundred yards of cratered mud, hundreds of thousands of men were slaughtered or crippled. Shellfire, machine guns, gas, and mud swallowed entire divisions. By the end of that blood-soaked year, all three great armies, British, French, and German, were drained of manpower and morale, yet none could back down. Each side began to plan for another year of slaughter, convinced that one final decisive push might still end the war. Inside German headquarters, the exhaustion was becoming undeniable. In late 1916, Admiral Henning von Holtzendorf warned the Reich's leaders, "If no decision comes by autumn 1917, the war will end with the exhaustion of all nations and disaster for us." The warning went unheeded. Berlin, London, and Paris all believed 1917 would be the year they finally broke the deadlock. For France, the initiative would come from a man of towering ambition, General Robert Nivelle. The Western Front had hardly shifted since the first trenches were dug in 1914. Despite 2 years of relentless offensives, the Germans still held most of their early gains. The Allies had clawed back almost nothing at the cost of entire generations. But Nivelle was convinced he could change that. When he replaced Joseph Joffre as commander-in-chief in December 1916, the French army was nearing its breaking point. Yet Nivelle's victory at Verdun had turned him into a national hero, a modern Napoleon in the eyes of many politicians. He promised that his new offensive would break the German line in 48 hours and end the war within weeks. His plan was deceptively simple. First, a massive artillery bombardment to flatten the enemy front. Then, narrow concentrated infantry assaults breaking through before the Germans could recover. It would be the same formula he had used at Verdun, but on a far greater scale. The British Army, under Field Marshal Douglas Haig, would open a diversionary attack near Arras, drawing German reserves northward. Once those troops were committed, the French would strike the main blow along the Chemin des Dames at the Aisne River. On paper, it was a masterpiece of coordination, artillery, timing, and surprise. In reality, it was a gamble on the lives of hundreds of thousands. Behind the German lines, trench engineers worked feverishly to strengthen their defences. In the rolling hills of northern France, they dug new bunkers deep into chalk and rock, sometimes 30 feet below ground, reinforced with concrete, steel doors, and electric lighting. German soldiers began to joke that they lived like moles, surrounded by mud and the constant tremor of artillery. One survivor of the 6th Bavarian Regiment later recalled, "The earth trembled for days. We lived below ground like rats, black with mud, half deaf from the guns. You only went up when ordered. Up there was death." As 1917 began, both sides stood poised for another season of bloodletting. The French prepared for a grand offensive they believed would win the war. The Germans prepared for the inevitable, to bleed them dry once more from behind the wire. And in the frozen trenches of France, every man on both sides felt the same thing, that the next attack might be their last. Field Marshal Douglas Haig didn't mince his words. "It would be madness to place the British under the French," he wrote. "I do not believe our troops would fight under French leadership. I am prepared to be tried by court-martial rather than betray the army." For a moment, it looked like the alliance might fracture over command. The plan Nivelle proposed would have placed British forces under direct French control, at least during the offensive. Haig saw it as a grave mistake, not just tactically, but politically. British morale had already taken a pounding at the Somme. Putting them under French command could break what was left. Tensions ran high. Haig threatened resignation, so did Nivelle. Neither would back down. Eventually, a compromise was forced through in London and Paris. The British 1st, 3rd, and 5th armies would participate in the coming offensive, but they would remain under British command, not French. Haig also made another demand: more time. Nivelle wanted to strike in February 1917, banking on winter surprise. Haig argued the army wasn't ready, the artillery wasn't in place, the terrain was bogged down, and the intelligence on German defences was incomplete. He wanted May. The French agreed to meet in the middle. The date was set for April. The idea was still the same, a massive coordinated strike to break the deadlock. But the delays gave the Germans exactly what they needed: time. While the Entente focused on planning another hammer blow, the German Empire was quietly reshaping the battlefield. In 1914 and 1915, German doctrine had been aggressively offensive, sharp pushes, shock tactics, and quick rotations of elite units. But the slaughter of Verdun and the Somme had forced a reckoning. The Empire simply couldn't replace its losses. The Allies could call on reserves from across the globe, from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, and the colonies. The Germans had no such luxury. The numbers game was slowly turning against them. In September 1916, the Kaiser placed the German war effort under new leadership, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his brutal, efficient deputy, General Erich Ludendorff. Together, they abandoned the idea of endless offensives and pivoted to total defense on the Western Front. One staff officer, Hermann von Kuhl, recorded in his diary that, autumn, "There will be no final victory in the West unless we survive what comes first." They weren't planning to win, not yet. They were planning to bleed the Allies dry. The new strategy was bold, unglamorous, and purely mathematical. Rather than hold every inch of occupied territory, the Germans would pull back to a new, pre-prepared defensive system that would stretch the Allies thin, slow their attacks, and magnify their casualties. It would be called the Siegfriedstellung, better known to the Allies as the Hindenburg Line. And when Nivelle launched his spring offensive in April 1917, he would slam headfirst into the strongest defensive system the Germans had ever built. Ludendorff later admitted that by the end of 1916, even he no longer believed a great German victory was possible. "I spoke with Ludendorff alone about the overall situation," one senior officer wrote. "We were in agreement that a large-scale positive outcome is now no longer possible. We can only hold on and take the best opportunity for peace. We made too many serious errors this year. One of those errors was the stubborn insistence on holding every inch of the front line. For 2 years, German divisions had been packed into their forward trenches, shoulder to shoulder, with little room to move or dig deeper. It was a fatal habit. When the British or French opened an artillery barrage, tens of thousands of men were trapped in place with nowhere to go. The dead and the living shared the same dugouts. The army had to evolve or bleed to death." In December 1916, the German General Staff published a new directive that would change the face of the Western Front. It was called The Principles of Command in the Defensive Battle in Position Warfare. Its message was clear. Survival now depended on flexibility. The rigid trench line was dead. The new strategy was defense in depth, an elastic system designed to bend under pressure, then strike back when the enemy was overextended. The outer layer of this system was thin and deceptive. Lightly held positions, little more than a few shallow trenches and machine gun nests, served as a tripwire manned by patrols and snipers for the routine trench skirmishing that defined daily life at the front. But if the Allies attacked in force, these troops were ordered to withdraw rather than die in place. Behind them lay the real stronghold, a broad defensive belt of fortified trenches, concrete bunkers, and hardened machine gun positions that could tear apart advancing infantry once the enemy's barrage had moved on. Further back still, the Germans built a final zone, a reserve line of trenches, supply shelters, and counter-attack units waiting for the order to move. The logic was simple, but brutally effective. Let the enemy advance until his artillery fire fell short, then strike back with fresh troops before he could reorganize. The Germans would bend, withdraw, and then snap back like steel under tension. They also learned to use the ground itself as a weapon. In the early years of the war, most armies placed their machine guns on the crests of hills, where the view was widest. Now, German officers ordered them to be positioned behind the ridges on the reverse slopes. From there, the guns were almost invisible and immune to direct shell fire. When Allied troops climbed the hill, they were cut down at point-blank range before they even saw who was firing. It was a small change in theory, but one that transformed the defense of northern France into a deadly science. German divisions were reorganized to make the system work. Each division, known as a Stellungsdivision, was spread in depth rather than crammed along a single trench. The front battalions acted as screens and observers. Those in the center formed the hard line of resistance, and the rear battalions prepared to move wherever the crisis came. This layout allowed faster communication, cleaner withdrawals, and coordinated counterstrikes when needed. The most visible proof of this new thinking came in early 1917. Between February and March, the German army launched a massive planned withdrawal called Operation Alberich. Entire sectors along the Noyon salient were abandoned as German troops fell back to the freshly built Hindenburg Line, a new defensive fortress constructed according to the new principles. The withdrawal shortened the German front by more than 70 kilometers and freed up 13 divisions for future use. To outside observers, it looked like a retreat. In reality, it was preparation for the next phase of the war. When Allied patrols cautiously advanced, they found nothing but devastation. The Germans had left behind a wasteland. Villages were burned, bridges blown, wells poisoned, orchards cut down, and every road cratered with explosives. Even the trees had been sawn halfway through so they would collapse at the first gust of wind. It was scorched earth in its purest form. A British officer who entered one of the abandoned trench systems wrote of the eerie silence that greeted them. "Our patrols entered the hostile trenches only 1 hour after they had been vacated. Pretty sharp work. The German trenches we've taken over are deep, well constructed, and surprisingly dry. Masses of beer bottles, unfortunately empty, are strewn about. Gun cotton attached to shell cases and grenades has been left ready to explode when picked up or accidentally kicked. We've already lost 5 men this way." The Germans had adjusted. They had learned from Verdun and the Somme that victory was no longer about ground gained, but about blood preserved. Their trenches had become traps, their withdrawals, weapons, and by the time the Allies realized it, the German army had already reshaped the Western Front into a machine built to survive. But the British army had been learning too. The horror of the Somme had exposed every weakness in its doctrine and forced a painful but necessary reckoning. After the failures of 1916, British commanders began dissecting their own mistakes. One of the most damning patterns was in how their troops advanced. Infantry often moved forward in straight linear waves, a method chosen for cohesion and ease of control, not survivability. The theory was that artillery would crush the German lines before the men even left their own trenches. In reality, the artillery often missed its targets, and those advancing lines were torn to pieces. Another critical failure was command and control. Once the attack began and units came under fire, confusion was almost inevitable. If communication with headquarters broke down, which it often did, junior officers and NCOS would halt and wait for orders. But by then, their superior officers might already be dead, wounded, or entirely out of contact. This hesitation cost lives and ruined momentum. To break the cycle, the British, and especially the wider British Empire forces, began to adopt a more flexible form of assault warfare. By 1917, the focus had shifted from division and brigade-level maneuvers to platoon-level tactics. Troops were trained to advance in open order, using the terrain, shell holes, collapsed trenches, natural dips in the ground, as cover. Rather than wait for orders, junior officers were now encouraged to take initiative on the battlefield. If a unit found itself under fire, it was expected to act, not freeze. Lieutenant General Julian Byng, who commanded the Canadian Corps, made it clear to his officers, "The man who does something is sometimes wrong, but the man who does nothing is always wrong." That was the new reality of modern war. Waiting could mean death. Action, even imperfect, was now survival. New weapons helped reinforce this doctrinal shift. In 1916, many British platoons lacked the firepower to hold captured trenches against German counterattacks. But by 1917, the standard infantry platoon had been restructured to bring more lethality to the front. Each 60-man platoon now included trained bombers, rifle grenadiers, and a Lewis light machine gun team. Heavy machine guns, once held far to the rear, were now integrated into assaults to provide suppressive fire. Coordination between infantry and support weapons had become a tactical priority. The artillery arm too had undergone a brutal post-mortem. During the Somme, British barrages had often failed to cut barbed wire or silence German guns. Ammunition was unreliable, and many shells simply failed to explode. Targets were spread too thin across wide fronts, leaving strong points untouched. In 1917, the British began correcting these flaws. A new instantaneous fuse, known as number 106, was introduced, designed specifically to explode on contact with the ground, rather than burying itself first. This dramatically improved the army's ability to cut wire and detonate shallow trenches. Observation also improved. Aircraft now worked in close tandem with artillery batteries, correcting fire in real time. British gunners began to prioritize counter-battery fire, using new methods like flash spotting and sound ranging to locate and silence enemy artillery before it could respond. The creeping barrage, or rolling barrage, was refined as well. At the Somme, each gun had been responsible for roughly 50 meters of front. By the time of the Arras Offensive in April 1917, the density had increased to 1 gun per 20 meters, and the fire was better synchronized with infantry movement. Underground, the British were also becoming more aggressive. Mining operations under no man's land expanded. Deep tunnels were dug beneath German strongpoints to lay massive explosive charges. Subways were also carved out behind British lines, narrow, reinforced corridors designed to move troops to their jumping-off trenches in safety, hidden from enemy eyes and protected from shell fire. By early April 1917, all of these lessons, all of these adjustments, were about to be tested in battle. The British diversionary offensive, designed to draw German forces away from the French Nivelle Offensive further south, began under grey skies and cold winds. It would be known as the Battle of Arras. In German reports, it was called the Schlacht bei den Australiern, the Battle of the Australians. 18 British divisions, supported by over 3,000 guns and 48 tanks, went over the top on April 9th. The ground shook as the artillery opened fire, and across the front, British Empire troops surged into no man's land with new formations, new firepower and new confidence. The opening phase of the offensive would become one of the most successful Allied operations of the war. At Vimy Ridge, the Canadian Corps stormed a position that had withstood repeated attacks for years. The Germans had fortified the ridge with deep bunkers, interlocking trenches and layered machine gun nests. From its heights, they could observe the surrounding countryside for miles. Capturing it would mean not just a tactical gain, but a symbolic one. And this time, unlike on the Somme, the British and Canadian troops came prepared. Vimy Ridge had stood for years as one of the most fortified positions on the Western Front. It had weathered repeated French offensives, costing thousands of lives, and it gave the Germans clear visibility over the Allied rear lines for miles. But on April 9th, 1917, the Canadians, with coordinated British artillery and infantry support, took nearly all of it in a single day. This wasn't luck. Canadian and British guns had been hammering the ridge for days before the infantry moved. Over 80% of known German artillery positions had been identified in advance and targeted with pinpoint counter-battery fire. When the Canadians went over the top, the German line was already fractured, bunkers smashed, communications cut, and forward positions dazed or buried. Using new small unit assault tactics, Canadian platoons advanced swiftly across no man's land, reaching the first trench line in less than an hour. As they began clearing bunkers and strongpoints, fresh assault teams leapfrogged through the first wave, continuing the advance without pause. The speed and coordination caught many German units off guard. Stunned, scattered, and often shell-shocked, the defenders surrendered in large numbers. 17-year-old Hermann Kraft was one of over 4,000 Germans captured during the battle. His recollection, part fact, part dream, described the moment of collapse. Our sergeant ordered us up the stairs, going first. Suddenly he yells, "Tommies!" and fell back dead, tumbling down. One of our old hands, he was 22, came down and told us to drop our weapons and come up. The English were all over us. Kraft then claimed to have walked up the steps into the arms of a towering Canadian holding a baseball bat. One had no helmet, no hair, just a tuft on his scalp. His face was painted white and red. He looked fearsome. I realized he was a Red Indian. These weren't Englishmen, they were Canadians. The latter part of Kraft's story is almost certainly a figment of his imagination, the product of trauma, confusion, or sheer myth-making, but it captures the intensity and alien strangeness of what many young German conscripts must have felt in those moments. They'd spent months preparing for another slow Allied assault, and were instead overrun in hours. By nightfall, nearly the entire ridge was in Canadian hands. The success had not been bloodless, but it was undeniable. The combination of concentrated artillery, new tactics, and decentralized platoon leadership had worked, as Canadian Private Bill Tapper of the 38th Battalion wrote afterward. "We went over supported by the Lahore Divisional Artillery, and were they crackerjack? Why, the Germans had been beaten before we got there. It was a walkover." Of course, it wasn't. Vimy Ridge was heavily defended, and the Canadians paid in blood for every crater and bunker. But the battle revealed something deeper, that the German defensive doctrine, so effective elsewhere, had not been properly applied here. Their reserves were held too far behind the front. Local commanders had failed to execute elastic defense in time, and by the time the order came to counterattack, the ridge was already lost. The victory at Vimy was one of the high points of the entire Arras offensive, a rare combination of planning, timing, and execution. But elsewhere, the story played out very differently. To the south, near the ruined village of Bullecourt, the Australian and New Zealand divisions met a far harsher reality. British 5th Army Commander General Hubert Gough was eager to commit the Anzac Corps to the wider Arras effort, but artillery support was delayed. Rather than wait, Gough ordered the Australians to attack anyway, relying not on shell fire, but on a small force of tanks to breach the German wire and lead the assault. It was a mistake. The tanks were few in number, poorly prepared, and rushed into battle across ground they had barely surveyed. In the early hours of April 11th, they moved forward, slow, grinding shapes of steel, into no man's land. Some succeeded in knocking out German machine gun positions, but most bogged down in craters or were destroyed before they ever reached the wire. The Australian infantry that followed found themselves exposed, unsupported, and walking into a meat grinder. At Bullecourt, the promise of combined arms collapsed in the mud. Australian Major Percy Black reportedly turned to his men and shouted, "Come on, boys, bugger the tanks." Then he charged. The infantry followed on foot, unsupported, and into the storm. Though some of the Anzac troops managed to break through the first German trench line, they were too few to hold it. Exhausted, scattered, and exposed, they couldn't exploit the breach. Worse still, one of the key German strongpoints in the area remained fully operational, firing into their flanks and halting further movement. As momentum faded, the Germans counterattacked. In several places, they slipped behind the Australians and cut their lines of retreat. What had begun as a bold push soon turned into a bitter withdrawal as Anzac forces were driven back to their original positions. The assault had failed, and the reasons were no mystery. General Hubert Gough's impatience had cost the Australians dearly. He committed them to battle without proper artillery preparation. Coordination between the infantry and supporting fire was weak, in some cases completely absent. British artillery observers believed that forward German positions had already been taken and thus shifted their fire further back, leaving entrenched machine guns untouched. Lieutenant Colonel E. Drake Brockman of the 16th Australian Infantry Battalion laid the blame squarely on the tanks. The tank crew seemed to know little or nothing of an attack by infantry, and nothing whatsoever about the particular operation they were to participate in. In the case of No. 2 tank, the commander hadn't even synchronized his watch. He was 5 minutes behind, and didn't even know which direction the enemy was in. 11 tanks had been committed to the attack, only 2 made it back. Unlike at Vimy Ridge, where German defences had fractured under pressure, the German defence in depth around Bullecourt held firm. Strong points like the village itself were positioned to enfilade any attacking force, and counterattacks were launched with precise timing. As the Australians reached the limit of their strength, the Germans struck, driving them back with cold efficiency. The broader Arras offensive, then, was a mixed picture. At Vimy, the British and Canadians had achieved a clear success. At Bullecourt, the Australians had been thrown into a poorly coordinated assault and paid the price, but Arras was never meant to be the main act. It was, after all, a diversion. The real blow was coming further south, along the Aisne River, where the French had been preparing a grand offensive of their own. Despite the German strategic withdrawal in March, which shortened their front and shifted the battlefield eastward, French Commander-in-Chief Robert Nivelle pressed on with his plan. He remained confident. The offensive would go ahead in April. It was massive in scale. 3 French army groups would participate, representing 2/3 of all French forces on the Western Front. The central piece would be the Reserve Army Group, which would lead the breakthrough. The Northern and Central armies would conduct diversionary and supporting attacks. If all went according to plan, the main assault would shatter the German front within 24 to 48 hours, allowing a 3rd army to pass through the breach and begin a so-called maneuver battle deep in the German rear. It was bold, perhaps too bold. Nivelle intended to reuse the same methods he had employed at Verdun: narrow, focused assaults supported by overwhelming artillery fire, Unlike the methodical broad-front advances of the Somme, which had given the Germans time to reinforce, Nivelle believed in momentum, shock, breakthrough, and exploitation. In his view, the key to victory wasn't just firepower, but morale. A fighting spirit, he believed, could overwhelm any obstacle. "The experience is conclusive," Nivelle declared. "Our method has proven itself." He believed he was about to end the war, but not everyone shared his confidence. British liaison officer Edward Spears openly questioned both the scale of the offensive and Nivelle's ability to command such a vast force. The narrow raids of Verdun, Spears noted, had been executed with limited objectives and well-defined fronts. Applying that same principle to a multi-army operation across a widened front against prepared German positions was an entirely different prospect. Spears wrote, "What remained to be seen was whether the glorified raids of Verdun were applicable on a large scale, and above all, whether Nivelle was strong enough to keep his head in the lonely and dizzy height of supreme command." The French had introduced some tactical innovations, but these focused less on infantry movement, which had already been reformed in earlier campaigns, and more on raw firepower. French infantry units were now issued with 16 light machine guns for every 250 men, a staggering increase compared to just a year earlier. Despite his personal skepticism toward tanks, Nivelle allowed 160 Schneider and 16 Saint-Chamond tanks to be allocated to the reserve army. But artillery remained the centerpiece of the plan. By January 1917, the French had over 6,100 guns in position, with more arriving by the week. New artillery methods aimed to push the rolling barrage faster than before, to maintain pressure and prevent the Germans from regrouping. The final hope was that, once the breach was made, the French could transition from trench warfare into open maneuver, a dream that had haunted both sides since 1914. But as April neared, questions remained. The Germans had already reshaped the battlefield to their advantage. Their lines were shorter, stronger, and packed with fortified fallback positions. They were not the same enemy Nivelle had faced at Verdun, and yet the French offensive, vast, complex, and dangerously overconfident, was now in motion. As the assault drew near, cracks began to show, not on the German side, but within the French High Command itself. General Joseph Michelet, the man tasked with leading the reserve army group, the spearhead of the entire operation, had lost faith. He warned that the German withdrawal in March had fundamentally altered the tactical landscape. Their new positions were more compact, heavily reinforced, and better suited for defense. But Nivelle dismissed the concerns. He was convinced that the enemy retreat meant weakness, not adaptation. Others were more blunt. General Philippe Pétain, a veteran of Verdun and one of the few voices of caution, questioned the logic of Nivelle's strategy altogether. Concentrated artillery fire on narrow sectors, Pétain warned, might be impressive on paper, but across such a wide front, it would be ineffective. He likened it to pouring the waters of Lake Geneva across the Sahara. Even the greatest deluge, when dispersed over such an expanse, loses its power. Worse still, there were signs that the Germans knew what was coming. Nivelle's loose lips had become infamous. He spoke freely about the upcoming offensive, at dinners, in interviews, even to officers without clearance. Operational security was minimal. Then, on April 4th, German patrols captured documents that revealed key elements of the French plan. The element of surprise, already fragile, was now gone. Still, Nivelle pressed ahead. He promised that if a breakthrough did not materialize within 48 hours, he would halt the offensive, yet in private he remained confident it would take just 3 days to collapse the German line. On April 16, 1917, after a 14-day artillery bombardment that fired millions of shells, the assault began. At 6 a.m., the French 5th and 6th Armies surged forward across a 40-kilometer front on the Chemin des Dames ridge. At first, it looked like the plan might work. Within the first hour, French troops had taken the German front line and reached the base of the ridge, but the victory was deceptive. The German defenders, following their new doctrine of elastic defense, had pulled back to stronger positions behind the crest. As the French advanced, they ran into uncut wire, concrete bunkers, and machine guns perfectly placed on reverse slopes, just out of reach of French artillery. Nowhere was the slaughter more brutal than in the Senegalese units of the 10th Colonial Division. One battalion was nearly annihilated trying to advance across open ground, funneled directly into the killing fields of the Islet Valley. General Paul-François Grossetti Blondlat, commanding the 2nd Colonial Corps, remembered the moment with bitter clarity. The infantry descended into the valley. There they were welcomed and fixed in place by the deadly fire of numerous machine guns, located on the reverse slope, untouched by our barrage. In minutes we lost hundreds, especially among our officers. Many halted, took cover, and in some sectors withdrew back to the trenches they had only just left. Then came the second wave, but it ran straight into the first. Confusion reigned, lines became tangled, orders were shouted and lost in the thunder. Morale cracked. That afternoon, tanks managed to help take the village of Juventud, but at a staggering cost. German artillery crews, positioned well to the rear and untouched by the French barrage, picked off the French tanks one by one. German counterattacks soon followed. In some sectors, French troops clung desperately to the modest ground they had gained. But elsewhere, their flanks were exposed. With neighbouring units either stalled or retreating, the forward elements had no choice but to stop and dig in, and they did so in some of the worst conditions of the war, under constant fire in waterlogged shell holes without proper supplies, with corpses piling around them. Morale collapsed, especially among colonial units who had taken the brunt of the German machine guns. Some refused to go forward again. Still, Nivelle persisted. The offensive continued into April 17th, 18th and 19th. There were localized gains. Over 5,000 Germans were taken prisoner, but every mile cost mountains of blood. On April 20th, the truth became impossible to ignore. The attack had failed. The breakthrough never came. The rolling barrage had failed to smash the defense in depth. The tanks had floundered. The infantry, even with new tactics, had been shredded by fields of fire the artillery couldn't touch. And the Germans, far from being on the verge of collapse, had absorbed the blow and held the line. German Staff Officer Hermann von Kuhl wrote with icy certainty, "By the 20th of April, it was clear the battle had already been won. By the end of the second day, the fate of Nivelle's grand offensive was already sealed." The breakthrough he had promised, within 48 hours no less, hadn't happened, and once it failed to materialize in that narrow window, it never would. From the outset, everything had gone wrong. The weather was appalling. Rain and sleet turned the battlefield into a churning swamp. Observation balloons were grounded. Aerial reconnaissance was nearly impossible, and that mattered, because in April 1917, the Germans enjoyed practical air superiority. Their planes dominated the skies, limiting French visibility and shielding their movements from Allied observers. French artillery, once seen as the decisive edge, now stumbled. The creeping barrage, designed to protect the advancing infantry, moved too fast. Instead of sheltering behind a curtain of fire, French troops often found themselves racing to keep up or stranded in the open once the shells passed. Even the famed French gunners couldn't change what they couldn't see. And by the time infantry reached German wire, defenders had already repaired breaches caused by earlier shelling. Worse still was the ground beneath their boots. The Chemin des Dames Ridge hid an extensive network of German tunnels, reinforced shelters, ammunition depots, even bunkered command posts. While millions of French shells tore up the surface, thousands of German troops remained shielded underground, untouched. French artillery had fired more than 11 million rounds, yet many never reached their intended targets. That failure came at a cost. Nivelle had expected a short, rapid campaign, not a prolonged grind. And as the hours stretched into days, French ammunition stocks began to run dangerously low. The guns fell silent, not from enemy fire, but from lack of shells. But ultimately, what killed the offensive wasn't logistics, it was German doctrine. Their elastic defense had absorbed the initial blow and then snapped back. As April rolled into May, the French kept pushing, but the momentum was gone. Attacks lost their shape. The initiative was now with the defenders. By the time it was finally over, 134,000 French troops were dead or wounded, and the psychological toll was even greater. Across the army, tens of thousands of soldiers, veterans, reservists, colonial troops, simply refused to fight. Units mutinied, whole divisions broke down. The French High Command faced a crisis deeper than any they had seen before. Nivelle's war-winning offensive had collapsed, along with morale. To the north, the British diversion at Arras had achieved some tactical successes. Vimy Ridge had fallen, but it hadn't drawn German reserves away from the Aisne, as planned. In both battles, the pattern was the same: early gains, then slow, grinding attrition. The Allies were learning they could take more ground than they had in 1916, but they hadn't yet solved the riddle of trench warfare. Tactical progress existed, but the promise of victory remained just out of reach. In May 1917, Nivelle was finally removed from command. He left behind a legacy marred by arrogance, tactical rigidity, and a fatal underestimation of the enemy. Historians would later describe him as suffering from strategic blinkers, the inability to change course, even as the facts changed around him. For months, Nivelle had argued with British commanders, dismissed his own staff's warnings, and clung to a plan that was rapidly unraveling. When told that the Germans had doubled their strength in the sector, he replied that it only meant the victory would be more impressive. When the Germans withdrew to a stronger line, he refused to adapt the plan, and when everything began to fall apart, he simply pressed harder. Even David Lloyd George, once one of Nivelle's strongest supporters, changed his tune. General Nivelle in December was a cool and competent planner. By April, he had become a crazy plunger, and yet, it's worth asking. If the offensive had been launched back in February, as Nivelle originally intended, would the outcome have been different? Back then, the Germans were still stretched thin in the Noyon salient. Their withdrawal hadn't yet shortened their lines, and the element of surprise, lost by April, would still have been intact. But all of this misses the deeper failure. Nivelle viewed the German army as a static, reactive force, a machine that would respond the same way it had at Verdun. He assumed that French willpower and firepower would be enough to crack the line. He assumed the enemy hadn't changed, but they had. The Germans in 1917 were not the Germans of 1916. Their new defensive tactics allowed them to stay mobile even while holding ground. They absorbed pressure, dictated tempo, and punished predictability. They let the French come to them, and then crushed them with counterattacks from positions chosen in advance. The initiative in 1917 now belonged to the defense.